So I'm going to talk a bit about innovation because all these discussions come around to innovation. I've got a number of somewhat disconnected slides, but we'll see if we can fit them together in this presentation. So let's start with venture capital, which is critical to the industries we're discussing today. And let me just show you a picture of what investment in venture capital looks like in the US. So the dark blue bars there are initial rounds of funding. The light blue are subsequent rounds of funding. And then the line is, in fact, the number of businesses that are funded. So you can see for both the line and the bars, that is, for both the funding and the number of entities funded, we're seeing really quite good growth for the last decade. See the big bubble there in 2000, and then subsequently pretty much growth in most years. And the same thing's happening in Europe. If you look at the European situation, it's a little slower in growth in the number of firms funded, but it is the funding is quite good. Now this stops in 2018. It's the latest data I could get, but basically things look pretty good on the venture capital side. Now there's another company that surveys venture capital, and that is known as PitchBook. And if you look at their data, you're seeing the same general picture with respect to funding, but the numbers have been going down. And this fact that the numbers have gone down has been noted by several observers, most prominently the Economist magazine that had a story a couple years ago. American tech giants are making life tough for the startups. So the PitchBook data is supposed to show that the slowing numbers are due to somehow incumbents preventing or discouraging entry. And it seems strange to me that we saw these two different pictures depending on whose data we looked at. So I dug into this a little bit. Turns out that PitchBook included angel and seed funding in their deal count, and VentureSource did not. VentureSource looked at the actual venture capital investment early and late. And that's important because the venture funding is actually 8 times as big as the angel seed funding. So angel seed stuff is like family and friends, small funding opportunities, a few tens of thousands, maybe a few $100,000, but angel funding, venture funding's in the millions of, and tens and hundreds of millions. So in fact, when you look at that picture, the green is the angel and seed funding. Many people consider that to be something of a bubble. If you look at PitchBook CEO, he said, after a couple of years of frenzied investments, the venture capital ecosystem is moving away from its financing peak and returning to normal, healthy investment climate. So contrary to what The Economist argued or stated in its review, venture capital is doing just fine. There was a bit of a bubble in angel and seed capital, but that seems to be back to normal now. What about R&D spend? Here's a nice picture. This starts in 1953 and looks at the division of R&D funding between the government and business. So back in the 50s, the government was funding most research, and now it's become businesses funding most research, quite a difference. Luckily, the private sector has stepped in and is funding basic research. If you look at the GAFA companies, Amazon, Alphabet, what else we got? Well, Microsoft, Apple, that is the red lines here, the red bars, they are really doing a lot of R&D. And there's a kind of a geographic picture there too. If you look at the EU, you see autos and pharma are the companies that are doing the R&D. In Asia, it's telcos, Samsung, Huawei, and so on. And in the US, a lot of it is the online businesses that people have referred to already. And you would think that this diversification across geographic borders would be a good thing. Remember Ricardo and wool and wine and comparative advantage. But there's a lot of anxiety in the governments. The EU, even though they have a very strong position in autos and pharma, they say, oh, we want to be online. And Asia says, well, yes, we have a strong position in telco and consumer electronics, but we want to be in pharma or whatever. So there's a lot of jockeying in terms of these sectors. Google, for example, R&D as a fraction of revenue has doubled. It's doubled since 2002. And really, there's a very large group engaged in basic research of all sorts and a very high quality. If you look at the major conferences, this is a neural net conference, the leading papers, in terms of number of papers, Google, Stanford, CMU, MIT, and Microsoft Research are the big players in that domain. And this is machine learning, where we saw the same thing below. We saw the same thing happening in that area. And here's a nice little slide. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Kaggle. Kaggle is a company that does machine learning competitions. So they actually are owned by Google. I was an angel investor in Kaggle several years ago. And they're just going gangbusters because companies are coming in with real problems where machine learning will make a difference. They're putting up real money, and people are competing for that prize money. Recent example is a case of funding from the real estate industry. Zillow wanted an improvement on their model for forecasting housing prices. They paid $1 million prize to a 3-person group who came up with the most effective machine learning model. And that was comprised of a Canadian, an American, and a Moroccan who met online, and it came up with the best model for this, for Zillow. And here's a great picture of our quantum computing framework, which I think is located in Santa Barbara. Not quite sure where it is these days, but we recently announced quantum supremacy, showing a problem that could not really be solved by existing digital computers, but could be solved in the quantum realm. Acquisitions, another big part of innovation. One thing that people don't really appreciate is since 1992, there have been 5 times as many exits via acquisition as IPOs. So the normal mode, the most common mode for exiting venture funding is via acquisition, not by IPO. And this is, here's a picture, IPOs in blue and acquisitions in red. And you can see what's going on in that industry. That's a change since the 90s, but it's been going on for at least 30 years. And startups are well aware of this. There's a really nice survey run quarterly by the Silicon Valley Bank that asks, among other things, what's the realistic long-term goal for your company? 57% of the respondents said it was acquisition in 2018 and 50% in 2019. Only 18% said it was IPO. Many acquisitions in Silicon Valley. In fact, I think I would say most acquisitions are acqui-hires. That is hiring a small team of people that have some expertise in a particular domain. Examples from Google. We saw early on that voice recognition was going to be a big deal when we moved to mobile computing. And we started a little service called Goog 911, Goog 411, excuse me, typo in the slide there, should be Goog 411, where we provided online directory services. And by providing those directory services, we were able to get tons of data for voice recognition. We hired researchers who could analyze that data, both by hiring individuals and by hiring, acquiring companies that had expertise in that area, and were off and running. Android, which of course is a huge success now, that was a 5-engineer acquisition. There were 8 employees in Android when we acquired it. There was no product. They had a vision of a product. They had ideas. We thought they were great ideas. We added a few $1 billion and a few thousand engineers, and 2 years later, we had a product, the Android operating system. It's a lot easier to hire a team of engineers than it is to hire 5 separate individuals. plus you get the team, which is an important issue. So these acquisitions are generally not to acquire a product or a market, but in fact acquire that expertise. You read a lot in various places about the kill zone. So what's a kill zone? That's an area that's not worth operating in since defeat is guaranteed. Well, the first observation you want to make about that statement, of course, venture capitalists are going to look where the best opportunities are. They're not going to look at places where they think there's not going to be some potential for innovation. And as an example, let's take AI. Google, Apple, Amazon, China, Europe, countries have announced AI initiatives and strategies. Surely no startup would want to enter this kill zone. But look, if you look at the actual numbers of fundings in different areas, 610 companies in 2018 entered into artificial intelligence related activity. So what they're looking for, of course, is to be acquired, because startups want to be in sectors where there are lots of acquisitions, since that's the normal means of exiting from venture capital funding in today's world. And finally, the last point I want to make is all of this research is in vain unless there's some way it can disseminate across different research teams, across different countries, across different sectors. And if you look at what it looked like to enter new sectors 20 years ago, you had to build or lease data centers, you had to acquire the hardware, the software, the networking. A lot of it was proprietary, was costly to acquire. Nowadays, open source tools, standardized, available at from several different vendors. Everyone now has access to technology that only the richest companies could afford a few decades ago. Image recognition, communications, coordination, search are all available as servers. It's you build your capabilities by combining the services offered by these by this cloud computing data centers. I coined a word a few years ago called micro multinationals. And a micro multinational is a company that's born digital, born international. You can use the tools like the tool we're using now, Zoom, to in fact coordinate activity within the company. These are tools that only the largest multinationals could afford a couple decades ago, but now virtually they're free. And it's not only in the technology area, but it's also in business services. There's a little slide on how to start up a startup, from funding to hiring, to renting office space, to cloud computing, on and on and on. You can purchase these business services on an as-needed basis and scale as necessary. And finally, I think I'm on my last slide here. Yes, Zooglers. A Zoogler is an ex-Googler. And we did a little study that they've created more than 2,000 startups, 10 times the number of companies that Google's acquired in the last year have been created by people who previously worked at Google and brought the operating procedures used there into the rest of, into their own business. And the same sort of thing is true of Facebook. The same thing is true of Microsoft. Been around for a long time now. And this is one of the ways that you see these practices disseminated around the globe. Here's a picture of a few of the Zooglers. One of them has started a fund, a venture fund that invests only in businesses that basically were spin-offs from Google via this particular route. So that's the end. Thank you.